The way that I often will approach a problem is to first kind of seek out as much prior art as I can to just kind of get a foundation of like, especially in something like Go where I was a relatively new developer, right? Like probably other people have thought about this problem and have more knowledge and experience to bring to bear. So me following the examples of what other people have done is likely to end up with something better than me trying to just invent something that is going to be basically Ruby poorly translated into Go.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 303. How to develop a CLI in 2025. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Victor, how much of your time each day do you think you spend at the command line running CLIs?
How many hours there is in a day? 24 minus 8 hours sleep. Let's say 1 hour for lunch. Let's make it 2 hours for food. That would make it 14 hours.
That sounds about right. 14 hours. Because can you get your job done today at all without going to the CLI?
No, that wasn't the correct question. Within the same amount of time?
Okay, same amount of time.
Then no.
Okay. So on today's show, we have Wesley Beary on. Wesley, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
So we have Wesley on. He's from Anchor, and we'll talk about Anchor sort of throughout the show today. But Wesley had a blog post recently called Developing CLIs. And it sounds like y'all went through a lot of pain and suffering trying to get your CLI built for Anchor. Is that a semi-fair assessment? Just taking a look at the first intro to the blog post, it was like, oh, this doesn't seem to be a good story at all.
Yeah, I mean, it was not as smooth as I might have hoped. Prior to that, I'd done some CLI work, but it was in Ruby, which for the Heroku CLI way back in the day when it used to be in Ruby. That had its own pains and sufferings, like distributing Ruby was not fun to multiple operating systems and people's computers. Like, hey, use our CLI, but please first start by installing a language. Could be better. But yeah, coming into the Anchor setup, some things were smooth, some things not so much. There's some nice Go libraries, but some things that they leave you wanting for, I think. So
at least you don't need to worry with distribution.
Yes, the distribution problem is very solved, thankfully. So check that one off the list.
Was that really one of the first things you wanted to make sure you didn't have to deal with from a CLI perspective?
Yeah, that was high on the list, really. We wanted to make sure that whatever we did was easy to distribute, similar to some of the other stuff we're doing. Like we're also, making it so that you can potentially get your certificates in like a Ruby gem or node package or etc. Like being able to be really cross-platform and work for as many people as possible was very, very high on the priority list.
Darren knows whenever we saw some new tool, new CLI, where the installation instruction is pip install or npm this or that, I freak out a bit. Yeah. I don't want to look at it anymore after that point. It's just so ridiculous anymore, today at least, that we don't get CLIs as a simple binary distribution.
Yeah, I mean, if it's pip or something else, it's like, that's great if that's the only tool you ever have to install. But as soon as you have more than one tool and they need different pip versions or whatever else, it just, rapidly escalating dependency nightmare. So no, thank you.
Everything we're saying here, it sounds like you wrote everything in assembly, right? That's how you decided to write your CLI.
Yeah, I mean, I've been around the block a few times, tried different things, and yeah. So moving into Anchor, Go was kind of defined for me in part. That's what the CTO had started working in. So that also was part of it, right? That was how he made the choice. He was more familiar with Go than me. To be totally transparent, part of the pains of developing this in Go was that I had never worked in Go before. So this was my first Go project. And, some of it is just wrapping my head around all of that coming from, again, mostly Ruby in my background, which a lot different approach and a lot different feel, I guess, to Ruby language than to Go language. So just some growing pains there as well.
But now, after all the time, what would you choose between the two?
I mean, it's hard to beat the distribution, and a lot of the biggest pain points we found ways to work through. So that's been very nice. I mean, that being said, I do miss the ease with which you could do sort of more meta programming in the Ruby context, right? It was a lot easier to write tooling that helped me to write tooling versus in Go. I feel like I'm stuck in a lot of things where I'm doing a lot more boilerplate, or in effect, copying and pasting a whole thing to another place and making small tweaks because it feels just easier to do that than it would be to try to abstract it, even though it's technically possible. There are trade-offs, there's some development cost, even though we get this sort of distribution runtime benefits, right? So that's the thing, distributing something that you hope lots of people will be able to use, it's very easy to install and use, is that sometimes you just have to eat those pains at the development side of things, right? So that people don't have to eat it on the other end.
If people haven't read the blog post yet, one thing that you call out is, okay, you went down the normal suspects in Go, at least. Cobra, Bubble Tea, which stack those two together, you get a different use case. But one thing you were talking about is tests. I mean, coming from Ruby, I'm assuming you lived writing tests a lot first.
Yes.
Maybe not first, but a lot.
Yes.
And that was one of your big frustrations, it sounded like, going down the Go route.
Yeah, I mean, just given my predilections, I guess, the way that I often will approach a problem is to first kind of seek out as much prior art as I can to just kind of get a foundation of especially in something like Go where I was a relatively new developer, right? Probably other people have thought about this problem and have more knowledge and experience to bring to bear. So me following the examples of what other people have done is likely to end up with something better than me trying to just invent something that is going to be basically Ruby poorly translated into Go, right? You see that with the new developers in a language a lot of times where they basically just try to recreate the patterns that they're used to, even though that doesn't make as much sense. Yeah, I quickly ran into this problem that I could find tons of examples of Bubble Tea programs, including, in Bubble Tea's own repositories and stuff, but almost none of them had any testing coverage whatsoever. And so then I was kind of left with this puzzle of what even is the right way to test this sort of thing. And, where, of course, do we do things like unit tests where we're just kind of testing the logic versus where do we do tests that actually check to see what the final output of this thing is and whether or not that matches up with what we want. And yeah, it was a struggle to find anything that would give me any kind of traction. The best we found, I think, ultimately was Bubble Tea within one of their experimental repos had a set of testing things called t-test that's based on the idea of golden files, which is also new to me coming into the Go ecosystem. I don't think it's a Go thing in particular, but it seems more common there, where you have a test that basically writes its output out to a file. And then when you run the test suite in the future, it says, did the output of this thing match what I recorded previously? If it did, the test passes. If it didn't, it fails. And you can run with a flag basically that says, I actually want to update the test this time around, right? And it's nice because there's a lot of contests for CLI stuff where what specifically it looked like mattered to us, right? So recording what the output was and being able to check over time to see if there were regressions, things like that was exactly what we were after. But unfortunately, nothing could be totally smooth. There were some issues because of the nature of Bubble Tea in terms of timing. There were a lot of race conditions that we ran into with their golden file setup where, just an example, we have a few different things in our CLI where it's sort of a transient output, I guess you might say, where something is displayed on screen for some amount of time while it's actually happening. So an example is sort of I am doing an API request in the background right now. Here is a little spinner, so something's happening. I haven't just frozen up, right? But in a lot of cases, once that's finished, we don't necessarily need to continue to have that on the screen. So we'll just clear the screen, right? Well, the problem with the Bubble Tea test suite is some runs, the output would display that spinner, and sometimes it wouldn't. It just would depend on when it happened to call the methods that would write that to file. And so you'd get a lot of test flake, right? And as I'm sure you probably have experienced, in some cases, having a flaky test feels even worse than having no test at all, right? So definitely things like that helped us to get like a couple steps closer. But then we felt like we had to kind of like dig in and figure out how to take that and turn it into what we felt like we really needed. So we created something instead where is much more predictable. We're still running into some race conditions, but not nearly as many, right? So it's much more common that anything that we say that we want to write to screen will appear in the golden files, right? So we just have golden files where instead of it being, this is the final output of the thing, it kind of writes, I don't know, it's almost like looking like animation or a flip book or something like that, right? So you see like each kind of frame of what's happening one after another. It's a little bit redundant, right? Because sometimes not that much changes between frames and things like that. But that way we can feel confident that everything was written. It's not as flaky. We get a lot more consistency. We avoid regression, stuff like that.
I think you're a very, very brave person. I use bubble tea and still use it. And I did not even, I gave up after 15 minutes. All the functions that are invoked, that's tested, right? But when it comes to charm in general, especially bubble tea, I felt like same challenges when I was a long time ago. Most people don't even know it probably. When I was working with Flash, Adobe Flash. No. Something is going to happen. Background, I know what's happening in the background. I know what my functions are doing. What people see is a mystery. This is me praising you, kind of like, well done.
Yeah, it took a few tries, and there are some quirky bits in there that are still, I feel like, can be a little bit hard to reason about. But we have bit by bit said, this is a problem. Let's find something that's a good enough solution to it. Okay, that's good enough. Let's move on to the next problem that we're having. And it's working for us so far. I think we've been able to put together a pretty compelling CLI experience. And I think the test coverage makes me feel, reasonably good. I don't know, with something like that where the things that actually, the golden file tests that are testing the final output, like those are inherently like more integration style tests, right? So I would say we have pretty good coverage there, but it's not that every single possibility of inputs and things that could happen that go through the CLI go through one of those tests, because they take a long time to run. They're very complicated to set up, etc. Right? But we're able to at least test a lot of the core paths, and that makes it a lot easier to say, oh, actually, I know that this CLI command that used to work and display things in this certain way doesn't now because of what seemingly is an unrelated change in the API, right? But now like this piece of data that used to come across the wire and be available isn't available anymore, and now it broke this, right? So it's nice also for me because I don't have to be the sort of like sitting around trying to be eagle-eyed to catch any change that might be remotely related to the work that I'm doing in the CLI that one of my colleagues might be doing and prevent that from causing an issue, right? Our CI will actually blow up. And so that's been very nice. But yes, I felt like we had to just figure it out because Charm didn't feel like they did us too many favors there. And again, maybe I was totally missing something, but that was kind of my experience. It's similar to what you were saying, right? Of just like, the documentation more or less seemed to say, you want to test this? Like, good luck.
So you brought up in what you just said there, APIs. We set all this up at the beginning. If you read the blog post, that's the first line you should talk about, release new API endpoints. If you're building a CLI, now everything we just talked about, you could have had a CLI that never reached outside of itself. No reason why we can't do that. We did that for decades. It just wasn't cool to call it a CLI then. You just called it a program. But now we have APIs. So in your point, you said release new API endpoints, build CLI actions that need those changes, realize mistakes were made in the API, and you sort of get into a doom loop as you start going further down the list. So when you introduce APIs for your CLI to call, what are y'all doing? Are you doing REST? Are you doing GraphQL? Are you doing protobuf? Are you doing whatever?
I lean towards REST stuff, or REST adjacent at least. I feel like I could get into arguments with people about what it means to be REST probably, but definitely more in that vein.
Go ahead and make your argument now, and your argument will stand.
All right. I don't have as much experience with something like protobuf, and I think GraphQL, I guess, gives me pause in terms of it's always felt like SQL injection as a service to me, I guess. I feel like the main use case that feels valid to me for GraphQL, or the most valid, maybe not the only case that's valid, is where you're providing a way for internal developers to quickly iterate and be able to make changes and try stuff and so on. but that you can go over and knock on their desk and say, hey, knock it off, or hey, make this change. I feel much less comfortable in the context of we're going to release this to the world and just deal with the aftermath. If somebody does something that's very difficult to impossible to optimize and is deeply relying on it and they're an important customer, we're just going to have to eat that pain somehow. Like that doesn't sound very appealing to me. I also believe a lot in like trying to provide a good experience to people. And I don't think necessarily telling them like, you need to figure out our user model and data model well enough to write queries against it in order to effectively do something is providing a very good experience. Given those kinds of edges, my inclination has been towards REST, where I feel like a lot of people at least have some amount of familiarity with it. It's relatively straightforward to understand how the pieces fit together. I feel like I can both use it as an interface that I provide to internal customers or external customers and feel comfortable and confident in that. You know, I think that we can do optimizations, we can lock things down if we need to, like all of those kinds of things. And so, yeah, that's the kinds of things that I did when I was at Heroku and designed the API there. It's the kinds of things I've done since then. And, you know, I've written a lot of client code too in my day, and a lot of that has been around REST clients as well. So just a space that I feel comfortable in and that I think a lot of people feel relatively comfortable in. That's where I tend to go. These days, in terms of like how we actually go about doing it, I'm a big proponent of spec first development. So we use OpenAPI. And generally, the way that I would proceed if I wanted to implement a new CLI command that needed some new stuff, like I was working on a command in the last couple of days, I wanted to add the ability to create organizations, right? Previously, you could list organizations and stuff, but we didn't let you create it from the CLI. That was all something you had to do on the web. I went into our OpenAPI spec, I opened it up, I added the create action, and then using a tool called Prism, we can spin up a mock server that just looks at the spec basically and can see what an organization should look like more or less. And so if it receives a create organization call, it gives you back a fake organization data blob. And I can actually then proceed from there to build out that CLI endpoint that I had imagined and see what inevitably I forgot to include in that endpoint or what I didn't get quite right, and quickly iterate by then changing that spec, right? Because as I'm sure you can imagine, changing a few lines in a YAML file is a lot cheaper and faster than changing, in our case, a Ruby implementation of an API endpoint and the associated tests and everything else that go along with that. And so that way I can often quickly iterate until I see that I have exactly what I needed to provide the interface that I was hoping for. And then at that point, another nice part is then I either can implement to the spec in Ruby, or I can even hand it off to a colleague in some cases and parallelize some of that work where we say, we've agreed on the spec now. I'm going to finish building out the CLI that goes with it. Can you finish building out the API that is going to back it on the other end? And then hopefully the two will just meet right up and be happy because they have a contract that they already agree to. And that's been pretty smooth for us. I mean, the not smooth part, of course, was like getting all of those things set up and the tooling related to it and figuring out exactly how some of those bits and bobs were going to work. But once that was up and running, it's been very smooth. And we do that in CI as well, where we run a lot of the test suite against mocks because it doesn't really need to manipulate real data and the test can run very fast that way. But then we run other things through real stuff where it matters, where we're okay with the extra expense and the slowness that comes along with that. And that's also provided a nice balance, I think, of correctness versus speed and those kinds of things.
When you're making a new call, you were talking about doing the create org. Why didn't you just do that to begin with? You had list, you should be able to do create. The reason why I'm asking this, I'm fighting with a vendor's API right now that I need to do things with the API. The only way I can do it is through GraphQL. I don't want to deal with GraphQL. I just don't want to deal with it. But yet they have a CLI, but they haven't implemented that thing yet, which is like, we want you to be using this. Go use our Graph API, GraphQL API. And it's like, I don't want to do that. So how can we, or I'm going to flip myself on the other side, how can we as providers of these APIs and more importantly of these CLIs, how can we make sure that we're sort of getting it right as best as we can from the beginning? Or as a new feature launches, making sure that is it really a product problem? We launch a new feature that's available on the API. Shouldn't we also make it available on the CLI at the same time?
That's a good question. I mean, we're still pretty early days and very small team. And so, we have to make decisions sometimes just based on resources available. So I think broadly speaking, when I am working on API, I would prefer to have the whole stack of CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, whatever. Maybe if there's other operations that are related to an object, like build them all out, right? And call it a day. But we right now have few enough people. There's 5 of us, right, that are trying to do everything that needs to happen at the company. We have to be a little bit more mercenary than that, a little bit more aggressive, right? Where, if we have a feature that only needs list, like maybe let's just implement list, right? Because that will get us to having that feature done more quickly. We also have maybe the benefit, maybe the curse, I guess, depending on how you look at it, of not having an expectation that our user base is directly hitting the API right now. Like we kind of expect that for the most part, it is just an interface that we are providing to ourselves, right? So that makes it safer and more comfortable to have a limited supply of things available there. And yeah, I think, we also kind of relating to what you were talking about, we're still debating. Sometimes there are a few things where, at least for right now, our thing that is in the web does it better. And so then it's sort of like, do we force it into the CLI even though it's going to be a worse experience? Or do we let it remain in the web context because it's a better experience? A concrete example, because I feel like I'm talking like very in the clouds in that, is we debated for a while, if you install our CLI tool and you don't have an account yet, how should you end up with an account so that you can actually sign in and proceed, right? And we had a debate, like, do we have on the CLI side something that actually moves you through the account creation stuff and you end up then with an account and you proceed? Or do we have something that basically says, hey, actually account sign up stuff is really something that's better handled by the browser. So we're going to ask you to go over there and do that and come back when you're done, right? And I think maybe historically was more of a purist, but these days I think, I try to do best tool for the job. And so in that context, we said, yeah, let's just kick them over to the browser and say, hey, like go over to the browser, especially since we in many cases are doing like an OpenIT based sign in, right? Where it's sort of like, yes, you can create an email based sign up, but you can also just use GitHub to sign you in, right? And like, maybe there's some way that we could do that OpenID bounce with the CLI, but it just seems like asking for trouble versus just doing that in the browser, which is what people are used to. I don't need to worry about introducing a new security vulnerability because I'm trying to do it in a weird way that people don't expect, or, whatever else that might come from doing that somewhere else. So yeah, there's some other things like that. And now, given that, we've thought about that in other contexts too. Like, hey, this already works in the dashboard. We'd like to expose it in the CLI, but maybe as a first pass, we just have something that says, here's the URL that you should go to. Like, we will implement this in the CLI eventually, but we haven't yet. We don't want that to mean that you can't get there from here, that you have to go and navigate through the dashboard and find the right place to actually do this. Like, we can help you out in terms of pointing you to the right place, but this is just like where it is now. So to your point, I think I try to make sure that there is a way for someone to do something, but it may not always be the same way, if that makes sense. We also, even within the CLI, have some things where, like, one of the biggest commands is this command that's just called LCL. It's to help you set up local certificate management stuff so that when you're running a server locally, it has real signed certificates that your system will recognize, and it actually has a bunch of substeps that it does. And it's possible that you can run each of those steps individually, and sometimes you would need or want to do that, but you can run it as this big amalgamated sort of like workflow as well. And that's another example of sort of like, I could have just released the thing that had this whole series of commands, and the way that you would run it would be to go to a web page that was a tutorial that said, here are the 10 commands you need to run in order. I've certainly seen that from a lot of other CLIs. I'm sure you guys have as well. But we said, ultimately, like, we don't want that to be the experience that someone has. We want them to be able to come in and run one command, especially if we know what the answers are, right? We know what the 10 commands are. Like, we don't need to tell you to go reference a document that we wrote somewhere else that has the 10 commands. We can just have something that runs the 10 commands in order and ties them together on your behalf. So that's been another big change that I think, again, is like a little bit different than I've seen other CLIs. Again, I guess going back to sign in, one other little thing that's kind of weird. You're probably used to this in the browser of like, if you try to run a command where you're unauthenticated that requires authentication, what would you expect? It's going to kick you over to the sign in page. You're going to sign in. It'll kick you back to where you just were. You proceed on your way, right? I at least don't think I've ever seen that in the CLI before, but that's exactly what we did as well. Like, if you try to run a command, it requires authentication. You're not authenticated. We know that. We know how to authenticate you. Like, why do I have to just like crash out the command and say like, you did it wrong. Please do it right next time, right? That's basically the experience that I've become accustomed to in CLI, but it's not a very pleasant one, right? So instead we say, oh, hey, we noticed that you're not signed in. Let me help you with that, We get you signed in and we say, great, you're signed in now. So that part is checked off. We know that the next step you wanted to do was probably the one that you were trying to do before we realized you weren't signed in. So let's just continue on our way, right? So again, it's like, I guess not trying to be too stuck in exactly how things have happened historically or how we've seen other tools do it or how even the CLI has done it versus the browser. We're trying to borrow from a lot of different contexts to just provide the best experience possible.
So you're treating essentially CLI as the first-class citizen instead of a helper in a way, right? What you're describing is something that I would be surprised if I go to, say, let's say, browser-based service that can be, that. Of course, there are cases where you don't have to be logged in, but I'm now talking about browser-based service that you cannot access without being logged in. It redirects you to a login page. But then the CLI of that same service doesn't, right?
Right.
Kind of, it feels like it's not the first-class citizen in a way, right? But in your case, it's the other way around, if I understood right.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some cases too where like there really are like features and things that the CLI does that the browser doesn't do at all, can't do really, especially as we talk about, again, things related to certificate management locally on your machine. Like we need to be able to do things on your machine, right? And the browser isn't going to be able to update your trust store to include the certificates that we just minted for you, right? Like that needs to happen somehow, somewhere. So yeah, we really lean heavily on the CLI to provide that tooling. I mean, it's also like, as you guys were saying, you spend so much time in CLIs, like we want it to be something that people are comfortable with above and beyond even what their experience with other CLIs are. Just like we do that with sign-in, it's the same thing. If you run a command and we know you need to select a service and you didn't provide one with a flag, again, instead of crashing, we say, oh, like we know how to look up what services you have. We'll just provide you with a selection list and you can choose which one you want to proceed with, right? Because at least in the interactive case, like why should you need to know that up front off the top of your head if we can just get it for you, right? Like we do also allow a flag, and if you provide it, then we don't put the selection up, right? But like, again, like we don't want it to be that like you have to get all of your ducks in a row and run the command exactly right up front. If it's something that we can help you to resolve, then we will help you to resolve it so that, again, better experience, smoother, faster. And, I think the other thing that's a little bit unique about the use case of certificate related stuff in particular is like, if we really succeed, you actually are going to run this like 1 or 2 times and walk away. And, it might be months or years before you run it again, right? Because hopefully if everything's set up correctly, we use Acme and stuff to do the actual distribution of the certificate. So like they're just going to keep renewing themselves and stuff. You're not going to need to come back to this that often. So I don't even want you to necessarily build familiarity and comfort with the CLI tool. I want it to do what you need it to do and get out of your way. I don't expect that you're going to like memorize all of the commands and all of the flags or whatever because you're in there every day using it. If you are, then like something has gone awry probably. Like that's just not what we expect in the cert case. I guess I wish that more CLIs were like that, like that they didn't expect that, like, I don't know, they were first and foremost in my mind and I was going to, memorize their man page because that's the way to use the tool, right? Like for some things, sure, like I use Git constantly in my development, right? So I know lots of Git, not all of it. I mean, parts of it still are just like totally befuddling to me. I was running into some of that today, but
you corrected yourself. I was about to call you a liar.
I mean, for the core stuff, there's like 6 or 8 commands that I use all the time. I know those well. I'm pretty comfortable with those. But, today I was doing like a rebase or something and they're like, this was changed by us or this was changed by them or something. And us versus them means a different thing in the rebase context than it does in any other context I could imagine. I had to like look it up and I was still confused and, like very complex tool. So easy to, I guess, poke fun at in terms of how well you could possibly know it. But I don't know that it does you very many favors in terms of helping you to learn it or helping you to get better at it or helping you to do things. Like it's left pretty much like, this is an exercise to the reader to figure this out. It's a very complicated context and system. Like, good luck.
Going back to what you said earlier, correct me if I'm wrong, you said something along the lines that, hey, in ideal situation, users of your CLI use it once every 2 weeks. It's just simply there. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Does that affect business in some sort of way? Because, in my head, from the business perspective, it would be easier to sell something that I see every single day, potentially all the time, right? Because, you interact with it all the time and so on and so forth, and you have higher perceived value of it. Am I completely off there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there's a reason that people talk about in terms of business metrics and stuff of like, how much daily active users you have or monthly active users, like the degree to which there is engagement with the tool, right? I think what's tricky with what we're working on, and like we're still working this out. We're still young. We're still building our customer base. Hopefully, it's growing, steadily. Could be faster. That would be great. But like I said, with certs, there is a long tail of how much it is changing or not. I think it's like anything that is oriented around automation. If your product is in the automation space, like ideally you set up that automation and you don't have to poke and prod the automation constantly, or else like what's the point of even having automated it, right? You're in for extra trouble now because the automation is a layer of abstraction that's not providing value to you, right? So for us, again, with Acme, it's similar to like Let's Encrypt and stuff too, right? The issue is like it's very high value and it's very important, but infrequently, right? So it's tricky. Again, like you said, I think getting people to understand that value proposition like is hard. You only have to have like one time where a cert expires when you didn't expect it and weren't ready for it before you understand very deeply the value of that, I think, or have to deal with the problem even of just like distributing certificates to new and different places. Again, very painful, but once you've done it, oftentimes you don't have to deal with it again for a while. I mean, you also run into the problem like if whether you're using our tool or not, like you don't have to do this thing very often, but you do have this context where, especially historically, the thing that you did have to do, albeit infrequently, was impossible to remember and inscrutable. It's like, what is the OpenSSL invocation that I needed for this again? Like I did it 6 months ago and I know it worked. It's worked since then. Now I need to do it again. And I do not remember what it is. It's like very arcane. It's like I have to cast this magic spell almost of like putting this particular set of parameters together in order to get the working certificate. And then I have to remember how I got it to all these different servers and how I then made them understand it. And I need to do that in a way that it's sort of not having downtime in the middle as that transition happens. And, it's like, I don't know. I don't want to have to remember all that stuff, right? I would much rather something just do it for me. But it is tricky, right? It's similar, I think, to what I feel like I always ran into when I was working on things at Heroku. And I tried to explain that to people who had a lot of cloud expertise and knowledge. They'd done all of these things themselves. They would be like, oh yeah, I've had to do that myself. I totally understand how painful that is. I would much rather pay you to do it. But when you talk to people that were relatively new to it, that didn't have those scars, they would be like, oh yeah, like we'll just write our own Heroku internally. How hard could it be? And you can't help but almost laugh of just like, oh boy, like if you're asking that question, like I guarantee much harder than you think.
I feel that those, if you can wait, those are the best customers you can ever get.
Yeah.
Those that, and I'm paraphrasing what you said, those that say, oh, I can do that myself. I can create my own. Why would I pay Heroku? I can do it myself. You just need to have patience to wait for a year or two until that sinks in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, the person that decides that they're just going to repair their own car or something, right? When they come then to the mechanic 2 weeks later and the car won't even start, the mechanic now has probably a pretty good customer for a while as they get that thing back up in order, So it's tricky, I think, to sell on something, at least in some cases, that really relates to a pain. So, I mean, that's one thing that we're really trying to, I think, figure out is like, we don't want it to be that the only reason you buy this product is because you've had that pain and you don't want to have that pain anymore. We also want to help people understand like the value of doing it this way, right? Like the value of doing a true secure context locally instead of the sort of pseudo secure context you use in localhost, right? Like, you can like actually do local testing and development against payment gateways if you have a true secure context, and you can't if you don't have that, right? And you can use a lot of the exciting new browser features that touch things on your system, like your webcam and other things that aren't allowed outside of a true secure context. Like all of that is cool and it's valuable. And it's like, again, like it's sort of the vitamins versus painkillers thing, I guess, right? Like, yes, I would love to take your pain away, but I would love even more to give you a new capability, something that you can be excited about, something that makes you stronger and better moving forward.
Oh, now you brought up a wrong example. I can bet in anything that painkillers sell much better than vitamins.
Yeah. You've had the pain. So, I mean, you're wanting to get rid of it. Not everyone is there, though.
You've already stated that Git CLI is your favorite CLI. Not. I had this thought, and somebody was talking about this the other day, and it just sort of hit me. The Git CLI is an expert tool for an expert user.
Git CLI is an expert tool for a masochist.
Okay, fair enough. But isn't that where most CLI authors start? Let me rephrase that. Isn't that where most software authors start? We're writing software and we expect everybody to be an expert from day one.
I mean, I think we often do, but I don't know that we ought to. I mean, that's maybe a separate question.
Well, no, you're right. We shouldn't do that. We should go back to the beginner. It's like, nobody's ever seen this before. How are they going to know what to do? So going back to how you were explaining the Anchor CLI, I came up with a phrase, you are basically dynamically completing for me what I didn't know that I was needing completion for. And all without AI, I would assume.
Yeah, and no AI presently.
Okay, good. No, you should have stopped at no AI, period. You don't need presently thrown in there.
Yeah. I think that lines up with my current feelings on it. So
I don't want AI getting into my certificates. We'll get to the certificates again in a minute.
Sure.
Okay, we're joking about Git. What CLIs do you think are doing things good right now in general?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the ones that I often go back to is actually the GH, which is Git adjacent. It's the GitHub's CLI, right? There are parts of that sometimes that I wish were a little bit different, but overall, they do a really nice job. It's also based in Bubble Tea. So in terms of when I was looking for examples, that was one that I did look to. They do have very nice test coverage. There is a lot of like harnessing an infrastructure that's very specific to them and how they do their tests, though, which made it not something that I felt like I could easily replicate without a lot of troubles, I guess. It's not easy to just replicate that. But yeah, GH overall, super nice. As we said, Git leaves something to be desired. I think a lot of Linux tools are very challenging in that way. I think, like you said, I think that categorization of like expert tools for expert users, I think definitely fits the design aesthetic, I guess, that I see around. One thing that maybe sets apart how I think about a lot of this sort of philosophically or whatever, I guess, is that I really see when I'm designing an interface for end users, the goal is maybe more about knowledge transfer than it is about them getting something done necessarily. I mean, I want them to get something done, obviously, but I want them to be able to learn along the way. So we also have a lot of like output and stuff that happens in our CLI that is to help you learn how certificates work and what it is that we're doing and why it matters, even though we could hide all of that behind the scenes. We could just say reticulating splines, spinner until it was done and then say you're good to go. But we want to take that opportunity to help you to understand the underlying mental model, the underlying data model, because eventually, at least some of our customers will get to a place where they want to do things kind of like we were talking about before, where they want to do something that is new that isn't quite in the CLI yet, or something that's at the edge. They have a more complicated use case that is specific to them that we don't support, but that they could support if they just knew how to turn the right knobs and pull the right levers. So the more that we can educate them and empower them to interact with certs in new and better and different ways, the more they can use our stuff or just encryption in general to be more secure, to be better developers.
Should every piece of data on the wire go through a cert, be encrypted, whatever you want to call it at this point?
Probably. I mean, we've seen that movement in terms of browsers and stuff, right? Like browsers are moving more towards almost everything on the web is HTTPS. Thank goodness for Let's Encrypt and other things that made the server side of that equation easier, but it doesn't totally solve it. You still run into some issues, like internal certificates are still kind of a pain, especially if they aren't exposed to the web in some way where they can talk to Let's Encrypt, right? Like, if you have a home lab or something, like actually getting certs set up on your home lab can be a pain. But in terms of doing it everywhere, yeah, I think it's like a defense in depth thing. The example I sometimes give is like, just because your house has fire extinguishers doesn't mean that you don't also want smoke alarms. Like you want to have many different layers of things, right? Or, if you have a burglar alarm, that doesn't mean you should leave your doors unlocked, right? Like you don't want to just rely on one thing to secure things. So even if you are running your servers inside of a VPN or something, like if somebody gets inside that VPN, you don't want them to just like keys to the kingdom. They can do whatever they want, sniff whatever they want. You would never know. It's much better to be able to say, yeah, that is one layer is the VPN. But if they get in, they still would need to be able to get a hold of the certs or do things with the certs. And like maybe they still could, depending on how they had infiltrated. But, extra layers means extra protection. And I think in many ways, the Bay Area wasn't that people didn't know that that was the right thing to do or that it wasn't the right thing to do. It was that it was too much of a pain to do, right? And so trying to lower that barrier, make it easier, simpler for people to just do the right thing, I'm hoping will drive more and more people to do that.
If you had to start all over again with the CLI, you said it had already sort of been started by the CTO.
Mm-hmm.
What would you have done different? Like if you were being brought in day one, it's like, hey, we've started roughing in the API. We know it's not even completely usable, but that's not greenfield. But the actual CLI is greenfield. How would you approach that?
I don't know that it would be too different from what we ended up doing. I mean, it's always hard because we learned a lot along the way, right? So I'm not crossing the same river, but what is it? I don't know. You can't cross the same river twice or whatever because either the river's changed or you have, that kind of thing, right? Like we learned quite a lot. And a lot of these things that I was talking about in terms of having the sign-in just happen or having the selectors that just work or whatever, like that wasn't something that I came into this thinking of necessarily. There were some things that were kind of adjacent to that I'd thought about. But yeah, I think a lot of it just took us iterating through and trying things. I think I would have done some of those things sooner probably, but some of them also involved just me like having arguments with the other people in the company and convincing them of trying this because as I think you guys realize, this isn't exactly like other CLIs, right? Like people, at least in my experience, don't necessarily talk about and implement them in quite this way. I think they could or should. That would be great. Like I think that they would provide better experiences, but convincing people to give it a try was a little bit of a challenge at first. I'm glad that coming into this, I had known the founders for about 15 years already. They were willing to give me, I think, a little bit more slack and a little bit more opportunity to just run with something and try it and show them, demonstrate the value. Whereas if I was brand new and they didn't know me from anything, that may have been much more challenging.
So if you're happy with sort of where you're at, you probably wouldn't change anything major.
Mm-hmm.
What would you tell people to do? Like if they're now being tasked with, okay, hey, we need an API, we need a CLI. How would you tell them to start? Especially if they're the freshers, right? They're the people right out of school or whatever. And it's like, hey, these guys are cheap. Let's just go ahead and put them on this because how hard could it be?
I mean, there's a couple different aspects to it. One is just similar to other things, although I haven't often heard it in this context, I guess. One of the things that I think makes you a much better producer of something is to become a connoisseur of it. And so if you want to make good CLIs, you should go and check out some other CLIs and see what they do and don't do. Develop a taste for what you like, what you don't like, what frustrates you, what excites you, like pull up GH. I think all of us kind of were nodding in agreement that they seem to do a pretty good job there, right? Like go through that and try to get a little bit of like, why do you like it, right? Develop an opinion about what the parts are that are good about it, not just, I know that it feels good when I use this tool compared to other ones, right? But why is that? What are the parts that stick out that make it smoother or less smooth? Similarly, like in my background, I wrote a bunch of clients for a bunch of different IaaS cloud providers, right? And so when it came time for me to write APIs, which is something that is broadly speaking, slow, costly, you sort of don't get that many swings at it in your career. I had a lot that I could draw from, right? I didn't have to totally start from scratch because I could say, hey, I know from my experience of sort of like being a critic in a sense of other APIs and being a connoisseur of them, that this is a pattern that I like. And I know that this is a pattern that I don't like. And it became even more handy when it came past the point that I was just doing all the work on an API to, there was a team of people that were working on the API and they would come to me and say, how about we change it in this way? And then it wasn't just that like my intuition was driving everything. I had to go through the struggle of turning my intuition into an explanation to that person as to why that was a bad idea, right? Like I could say, that will taste bad, right? Like in terms of the stretching the connoisseur metaphor a little bit, right? Like I have tasted a thing like that and it was not delicious, right? So let's not provide not delicious things to our customers, right? So that's a big one. The other part is, I guess, also relating to not getting to take that many swings and it being very costly is as much as possible, I try to do iteration on whether it's APIs or CLIs or whatever else in sort of the cheapest way possible before moving on to progressively more expensive things. And so I mentioned a little bit of this earlier. So when we're working on APIs, we write a schema that defines what the API ought to be like. We run mocks of that to do the CLI development against, right? Those both are ways to make it cheaper. On the CLI side, more and more what we've done, even in the early days, what we did was I would often write a simple program that would just spit out to screen more or less what we thought it ought to spit out to screen, that behind the scenes was not doing anything. All it was like a fancy way to print a bunch of lines to screen. but it was able to give us an opportunity to actually see what it would look like or what it would feel like to do that. Now all of us have become comfortable enough with the golden files that we were using before that often I'll just like make a fake golden file basically that displays what the output will be, because that's even cheaper and easier than a command that does a bunch of print lines, right? Because it's just a text file that I'm editing. But then that way I can quickly iterate, because with a lot of these interfaces, in my experience at least, and maybe someday this won't be true, like I always get it wrong the first 2, 3, 4 times or something, right? Like it's not usually that whatever the first thing that comes to mind for me is the thing that I'm satisfied with. I usually have to iterate a few times to figure out, oh, I forgot that thing. Oh, right. I need to include this thing that I didn't have in mind. And so again, like doing that iteration in the really cheap place, not the, let's implement this whole thing from soup to nuts, end to end. Let's do all of the CRUD operations for this resource or whatever, and then realize that you made some fundamental mistake in your understanding of the problem and have to go back and re-implement all of that. That's the other big thing. So move in the cheap places, learn from other people, right? Like I think those things can really get you a really long way.
What's your take on CLIs that think they want to become TUIs?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, mostly I don't know. Some of the things I described, I guess, in terms of what we do are kind of like on the edge of some of that, I guess. Like, you know, having the multi-selects and stuff like that, right? Starts to be almost TUI-like. I still like it to be mostly like, I've asked you to do a thing. Maybe you're a little bit interactive in the process of doing that thing, but then we're done. You know, like I finished this thing and we're out. It's not, I'm entering into your environment and then doing a series of things or whatever. I mostly like it to stay in that more functional space, I guess. That being said, like I'm a Vem user, right? Vem is a very TUI-ish thing, right? And that works well for me for what it does, but I don't want that for everything, right? Like I don't think I want a TUI for Git. I'm fine that Git is a functional tool that or GH or whatever, right? That I say, do this thing for me and it does it. And then I'm still back at my terminal going on to the next thing. So there are times and places, but I mean, I think it also is like I was talking about, like we're still having the CLI just kick you to the browser sometimes, right? I think there's a similar thing there of like, I don't know that the CLI necessarily, or a TUI for that matter, does it better. It can do it equivalently. But if it's just going to be equivalent, like, is there really that much more value in it being in that context versus some other context that already exists and is probably going to be cheaper and faster and more familiar for people? My sense is probably not. Like, you know, if it's going to be an email client or whatever, like my email client in my browser is fine. I don't find myself wanting that much. Like, I don't feel like I need a TUI version of that, but to each their own, I guess.
No pun intended. To each.
Yes.
Bad dad jokes. Sorry. So Anchor can be found at anchor.dev. You've been talking around it the whole time. What does Anchor do?
Yeah, we're trying to make encryption effortless for developers because, like I said, I think we realize that it's the right thing to do, but we've been bitten by just how much of a pain it is to do, right? Self-sign certs, huge pain. And there's not a lot of other good options for local development in particular. There are some things like MakeCert is pretty good, but there's still a good portion of that experience that's sort of left as an exercise to the user. And so we're trying to really take that and make it as streamlined as possible, as you can imagine, probably from some of our discussion about various things where we know, hey, like we actually know what you would need to do here. So let's just help you with the next step. That is a lot of the experience really, right? So the idea is really you can install the tool and you can just run Anchor LCL and it will do what is necessary to get you set up where your app has integration with Acme and uses Acme then to pull down a certificate when you boot it up and can renew that certificate automatically for you and just install that certificate into your local trust store. So when you boot up your browser, you actually have a true trusted context and you can do whatever it is you want to do. Again, like trying to just make that a natural thing that people will do, because I also have the experience from my career of looking at an open source project or something and somewhere buried in the README is by the way, here's how you turn off TLS. You should never do this, but we get asked so much about it because it's so much of a pain to properly configure this that here is the option that you just set and TLS will be turned off, right? I would like to put those days behind us.
So again, Anchor can be found at anchor.dev. And we'll have all of Wesley's contact information down in the episode description, along with a link to the blog post that we were talking about at the beginning. Wesley, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace or at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.